I would like to go to my next guest. He is new guest to this channel, the one, Todd Curtis. Todd Curtis, let me get that. There we are. Todd Curtis has spent most of his career in aviation, focusing on aviation safety. After earning an electrical engineering degree at Princeton University and the University of Texas, he served as the U.S. Air Force as a flight test engineer. After earning his master's degree in policy and management from MIT, he was a safety engineer at Boeing, where he supported accidental investigations as well as conducted safety analysis during the development of the 777. While at Boeing, he also created aviation safety website airsafe.com and wrote the book, quote, Understanding Aviation Safety Data, unquote, which described both his approach to analyzing aviation risk and evaluating accidents and incident trends. Since leaving Boeing, he has become a risk consultant, focusing on systematically using data to understand and reduce aviation incidents. He is also one of the contributors to Flight Safety Detective podcast, which evaluates accidents, incidents, and risk from all areas of aviation. Welcome to the show, Todd. Thank you for joining me, man. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to read all that because I wanted to give you a pedigree and how thorough that pedigree is, including working at MIT, meaning you know your stuff. You've been doing this for very long, and you have a detailed history and career involving aviation safety. The reason I brought you on, you sent me an email effectively asking me to come on the show about UAPs and UFOs. It has been heavy in the news. There's been all of this talk about drones recently, and we've even seen situations where there were aviation that wasn't allowed to take off because of drones that were in the air. Right here in Maryland, I believe, and right here in, I believe it was Maryland, New Jersey, and maybe even New York.
That's
not
correct.
Maryland. It was New York. It was New York and New Jersey, where the flight wasn't able to take off because the UAPs were in the air. And so this has been pretty prolific. I've never seen anything like this. And yet they still fly. They're still up there. Even with the US saying, you know, it's illegal in these various states for them to fly it, it's already illegal for them to fly it in regards to airplane zones. But you get also people like Ryan Graves, who was testifying before Congress, that they were seeing these things in the air and that these things were a threat to airplane safety because we have no handle on them. And in many respects, they're saying they don't know what they are. Give me your just basic take on this as we step into this particular subject matter. I've never seen anything like this, where there's something flying in our skies and we don't know what they are. And they have this tendency, or at the very least, potential. There's been some planes that have talked about nearly hitting some of these things. We don't know what in our skies. Give me your thoughts on this.
Well, first, once again, thank you for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure to introduce myself to a new audience. And first, I'd like to talk about some definitions. UAP is a term that's common right now for unidentified anomalous phenomena. And to make a long story short, UAPs are what they used to call UFOs, but UAP also includes a whole lot of other things, including unusual weather phenomena. I'm talking specifically about things that deal with things that are flying, that may or may not be objects, and definitely don't seem to belong there, and are behaving in ways that are either bizarre, extraordinary, or otherwise perplexing. And what you've seen around New York and New Jersey has actually happened periodically for decades. Yeah. And what we have now versus even 20 years ago is we have the internet. And something happens, doesn't matter where it is. It could be around the world instantly. Now, some of your audience might recall something called the Phoenix Lights, which was in 1997.
Yes.
A large object not allegedly, flew over the Phoenix area as well as other parts of Nevada and Arizona. And there were a few videos out there. But imagine, if you will, if that same event happened today, you would have literally tens of thousands of cell phones, security cams, baby monitors, you name it, that would be either taking audio or video of this. And instead of just having a handful of pieces of evidence, you have thousands of pieces of evidence. That kind of what happened in New York and New Jersey. Now, be honest, I saw some of the videos that purported to show UAP. Some of them were clearly misidentified as regular airplanes. You zoom in with your phone, it looks fuzzy and everything. That said, there was still a small percentage of these which were truly bizarre. And the government response was disappointing, to say the least. If you look at some of the folks who were getting in front of the camera saying, well, we don't think this is a danger and yada, yada, some of them looked like they were ashamed to be there. Some of them were struggling to say as little truth as possible because, honestly, in my opinion, this is something that they could not figure out. Go back in time just a year. Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, the major protection base for the Washington, D.C. area. They have F-22s there. Anything that's flying in the East Coast, up and down the East Coast, they might dispatch that jet at a moment's notice to go check it out. They had dozens of something flying over Langley for days on end. And I believe either early 2024, late 2023. And the military couldn't figure out what was going on. They didn't shoot them down, which is another story entirely. And they could not identify them. And the theories were, well, maybe it's Chinese with a ship offshore. Let's be honest. The U.S. has eyes in the sky, eyes under the water, etc. If anybody had a ship offshore doing something they shouldn't have been doing, including drug runners, they'd know about it. They might not shoot them out of the sky or sink the drug boat, but they know what's out there. So for them to publicly say, we're not sure what it was, they were probably right on a certain level. They weren't sure, and they couldn't even pinpoint who or what was flying this. Now,
wow, that's so bizarre.
And the bizarreness doesn't stop there in that, again, we've all seen the movies, Close Encounter of the Third Kind, etc. We've grown up on flying saucer movies. So one of the reasons that UAP was a term that was put out there was that there's a lot of cultural baggage with calling these unidentified, but there's less cultural baggage with coming up with a new definition. Now, I've been following government for decades because aviation is very much a part of government. That is, it is so wedded to regulatory realities and trying to keep the rules not just steady within the United States, but rules that can be followed around the world. So there's very, very specific ways that airplanes are supposed to operate, that accidents are supposed to be reported, etc. These things don't pay attention to those rules. They might be blatantly violating regulations, which is a hazard to air traffic, and they perform in ways that don't make any sense. But let's get back to why UAP? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons for it. One of them being the military has seen things in the sky for a long time.
Yes.
Your audience might have heard the term Foo Fighters, which goes back to World War II. But even before then, there have been reports of unusual things in the sky. The thing that attracted me to the subject, again, I'm very much in aviation safety. I analyze accidents and incidents. I've looked at thousands of reports over the years. Never saw one of them that clearly had, UFO written all over it. That said, having been within the industry, if I had been back in the Air Force or back at Boeing and we had something happen where there was a UAP/UFO involved, we might have shared the factual aspects of, yes, there was an unknown vehicle that flew into the range and did something. There's no way we would have put down the phrase UFO anywhere in the report because there was a cultural bias against talking about that. Even if everybody in the unit saw something, you're not going to put it down on paper because that just simply was not done. Slowly changing, but that was the reality then. I've taken a different approach since 2006. That was a time there was something called the Chicago O'Hare event, where something, no one knows what, floated over gate C-17 of the concourse there at the United Concourse there, seen by many people on the ground, including numerous aviation people, reported widely by the media, and seen by dozens and dozens of people. And whatever it was, hung around for a little bit, went up into the clouds. I didn't know who was flying that, what was flying it, or why they were flying it. What interested me was the government response. It was crickets.
Yeah.
5 years after 9/11, there was no outcry. There was nobody saying, hey, we had a security breach. There was no TSA or FAA or FBI saying, we're investigating this. There was nothing. As an aviation safety professional, I thought, this is nuts. Let me look into this a little bit more. And so slowly, I started methodically looking at, let's take the junk and put it over here. What are we looking at here? What evidence do we had that something weird happened? We had a bunch of eyewitnesses, many of whom were credible. There were pilots who saw it. There were ground personnel, people who've been around airplanes most of their adult lives in many cases. If you work around O'Hare, you've seen every manner of civilian and military airplane fly through there one time or another, helicopters, etc. Something that doesn't fit the pattern would really jump out at people's eyes. And it was something I looked at from a technical perspective for a long time. I was sort of like not too many people in my field doing this, because at the time I was a consultant. I can go ahead and do this on my own. I didn't have to worry about somebody firing me from my job or saying, hey, I don't want to work with you. It's like, look, I was the boss. I can do whatever I want.
Right. That's a good thing, right? That's a good thing.
In aviation, you always have to have a plan B. I grew up in the 70s when moon landing was happening. And I was a teenager when you had massive layoffs in the aviation business after the Apollo program and after Vietnam. Yeah. And I heard stories of PhDs driving taxis and everything else. I wanted to go into aviation. I thought, all right, I'm going to do aviation, but I'll hedge my bets. So when I was an undergraduate, instead of getting an aerospace engineering degree, I thought, you know what? This electrical engineering, computer science thing looks kind of interesting. Let me do that instead. Yeah. So I had a different perspective than a lot of the folks coming into aviation. And also, since there's always a plan B, there was always a plan in mind of, if the job played out, I have to be able to do other things. So those skills I built up allowed me to parallel do my aviation safety thing, do my UAP thing. But I'm talking too much. Let me get a question from you.
No, you're perfectly fine. I'm curious about something. I'm glad that you were able to go through to give the audience kind of your take, like how you view this stuff. I'm also glad that you were willing to kind of have an open mind about this. Like, obviously, if there's something in our skies, it's been something in our skies going back for like 80 years. The military has been lying about it. And the UAP thing that recently just happened is a really good example of, I guess, an encapsulation of what's been taking place over the 80 years. Like, for all intents and purposes, in New Jersey, New York, parts of Britain, other parts of the United States, we've had drones all over the place. People were reporting drones that have been loitering for like 8 hours, where they would come up from, like 10 o'clock at night, or let's say 7 o'clock, and be there until morning. And, for all intents and purposes, there's nothing that we have, at the very least, that are separate from military drones that can do that. Other people were reporting things that were the size of trucks or cars. Other people were reporting, and let's be very clear, some of these things are going to be regular drones. But other parts of these things in the reporting are very anomalous. Some of it seemed like they were military drones, especially some of the pictures. It seems like these were much larger, like something you'd see on a battlefield. Other ones seemed to be these kind of ball-shaped plasma, kind of indicative of Foo Fighters that was taking place in the Second World War. And so there seemed to be multiple things that were taking place. One of the most interesting reports was that it was loitering over military bases. Now, what got me involved in this, in regards to the most recent spec, I was a UFO correspondent for my network. I followed UFOs for the last 10, 15 years. This has been a subject I've been greatly interested in. What got me involved in this, initially I was like, okay, well, these are just drones. What's the issue? And then government started making their statements. So Kirby will come out and say something like, well, there haven't been any in the military bases. Nothing has been taking place in regards to public safety. Nothing to see here, folks. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. These things have invaded like 3 different military bases over the course of the last week, where even to the point where they were shutting down flights or shutting down the airspace because of drones. And all things being equal, from my understanding, the people that I've had on to talk about it say that drones under normal circumstances, A, don't fly at night, and B, have this kind of, I guess, transponder, or there's something built into the drone that don't allow it to go into military spaces. And so right off the bat, the US government is saying something that A, is demonstratively not true. And B, when they're saying drones, some of these people are pointing out these things were bigger than drones in some cases. And these are not following the flight parameters and patterns of a typical drone. Give me your take on that. Why do you think the government was getting this so jumbled, that there were so many contradictions in the statements that the government was making versus the truth of it? And it didn't seem that the government knew all that much what they were talking about. It was just very weird to me. Give me your thoughts.
What you just said encapsulates exactly what was going on. I believe that there is a lot going on most of which the government does not clearly understand, and they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Everybody and their sister knows this is happening because this is something learned early in aviation safety. If something happens in the world, it might be interesting. If something happens near New York City, the whole world is interested. So they really didn't have an option here of not saying something. When it came to the stuff in Langley, they had an option of saying nothing. A few years ago, there were multiple reports of large drones, sometimes in groups, over Colorado and I believe Nebraska, out in the Midwest. And it was widely reported in some circles, but not widely reported in major media. So,
by the way, California also, just to point out. Please continue.
And so what's the government going to do? I mean, when it comes to military bases, yes, what you said is true. There are some drones that are designed such that the software inside them doesn't prevent them from going in certain places. That's only a fraction of drones, because your commercial off-the-shelf drone, which I've had several, some of which can be extremely sophisticated, something that weighs, a pound or two, might have the capacity to use satellite navigation, not just from GPS, but also the Russian version of GPS, and to fly autonomously or semi-autonomously. You plug in a bunch of waypoints, you set it off to do its thing, and it comes back. But what really set apart some of these reports from what I know about commercial drones is that while elements of them were like a commercial drone, they might have had lights, they might have sounded like a drone, other elements didn't make sense. Something the size of an SUV, first off, you can't buy that off the shelf and have it as a commercial drone. Once it goes beyond 55 pounds, you have a whole different set of registration requirements from the US government. So if you're flying something that big, you're either doing it blatantly illegally, or you're doing it with the okay of at least having it registered. And as far as the military is concerned, they might be surprised, whoa, how can something fly over a military base? As a former military person, I know that the rules of engagement vary widely. If you're on a domestic base and somebody or something is penetrating the perimeter, you just can't just haul off and shoot them, because there are rules involved. First off, let's say it's your garden variety criminal. Well, they have security police in the Air Force, they have military police in the Army, etc. They deal with it that way. Let's say you have an incursion of an aircraft. Is it going to be shot down? In some cases, it won't even be noticed. Personal story from when I was in the Air Force. I was out at Edwards, my first assignment, which is the Southern California desert. Big base, huge base, a lot of activity going on, some of it very sensitive. I come into work one morning on Monday, and there was word out that a plane had crashed in the middle of the lake bed. And it happened sometime over the weekend, and no one saw it. There might have been people in the control tower, but they didn't see it. There might have been people at the radar stations, but it wasn't noticed. It wasn't until Monday morning that they found this crashed aircraft. Turns out the guy flew his aircraft, shot himself in the head, committed suicide. But I said to myself at the time, here we have the most important flight test center in the Air Force, in the military at large. And yet you had someone penetrating the airspace, not noticed for days on end. So if we can't protect this area with all the assets we have, what does that say about the level of security we have?
Yeah.
Well, it basically says, if you're looking for certain kinds of things, you'll find them. If you're not looking for certain kinds of things, or if you don't have the capacity to understand those things, you may not notice them. Or if you do, you say to yourself, well, this doesn't fit the criteria of what we have to call the commander force, so we'll just let it slide. Now, when you have dozens of them flying over the base, that's a whole different kettle of fish.
And that's been the reporting, by the way. I mean, the Coast Guard has been, and that was the other thing that got me involved in paying attention to this kind of New Jersey drone issue. The Coast Guard was reporting that dozens, like 20 or more, were effectively following their boat, and that they were being harassed by the drones. They were being chased by these drones. California, off the coast of California, I've had reporters here that were recording and reporting those events, that they didn't necessarily know what they were. I mean, I think they even opened a case on that stuff, because anything that happens in the US, you get the FBI involved in it, even if it's something like that. But for the New Jersey case, I couldn't frame in my mind what it would be to have like 20 drones following a boat. And my thought was, okay, well, I believe the Coast Guard in this. I don't believe the administration and talk about this. The Coast Guard seemed to be very clear. We were being followed by 20 or more drones. And it's like, okay, are there really 20 people out there doing this? Or is there really one person that is controlling all of these drones? Or are they functioning autonomously where they're working in coordination, but they're working in coordination with one particular thought? All of these things, by the way, is pretty astonishing in its own right. And yet, no answers. And even to this day, no answers. From your point of view, what should they do? Like, how should, if the administration had to respond to this, with all of your experience, what would you advise them in this?
I'd advise them to work on this behind the scenes to the greatest extent possible. Use whatever resources they have, military, intelligence, law enforcement, to get to the bottom of it. Now, as far as what they tell the public, they, again, caught between a rock and a hard place. They have a responsibility to secure the nation, its air, sea borders, etc. But they also have a responsibility not to reveal sources and methods, not to overly panic the public, and basically to get the situation under control. Part of that control might be essentially the song and dance you've been seeing from the public pronouncements. These are very intelligent people who've been, in many cases, their entire adult lives in this world. They know what's going on. They know a whole lot more than what they're telling the public. They're not necessarily trained in how to.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but therein lies the rub. Like, part of the UFO community, the belief is that the federal government does not have control over this stuff, and that they don't exactly know what this is. They may know that this is not us, but they don't necessarily know, like, they don't have a full, let's say, accounting and understanding of it, or for that matter, control of their airways. Like, how do you deal with the public if indeed you know it's not us? You know it's not Russia and China, meaning you know it's not a foreign adversary, and you know it's not us. And yet you have no ability to control what you guys are dealing with. For example, I'll give you an example. The Nimitz. You had a ship. I don't remember which coast it was on, but a ship. This ship gets a radar signal. Something is coming out the water. You get Fraser and Dietrich flying over to the area in order to view what it is because of the radar signal. They see something that they describe as this kind of tic-tac type thing that is having these kind of very weird flight characteristics where you couldn't necessarily identify how it was flying, but it was flying. And Fraser decides that he wants to cut into it because he wants to get closer to it. And within a split second, it's gone, just gone. And Fraser is sitting there like, oh my God, what is that? Now, you get radar signals, so you get that. You get visual observation, so you get that. You get all of the reporting of the signals from the aircrafts, and there were multiple aircrafts, 4 people in the air at the same time. You get that. You get the people on the boat. So you get a lot of information about something that was completely anomalous, that was flying in a way that we had no idea what it was, and had flight, let's say, capabilities that blew our planes out of the water. We have no control over that. We have no control. And if we have no control over this stuff, and I mean like maybe 1%, because that's all you really need. If we have no control, how do you explain this? Do you just come out to the public and say, look, there are things in our air that we don't know what they are? Or how do you square that circle?
Well, this is taking it a little bit broader. How do you understand anything that's unknown? Well, we have various organizations like NASA that study the sky. We have various universities that work in concert with government and have for decades to understand nuclear physics, medicine, any technological area you can think of. But this is one of those areas where that's not the case. There might be a lot of information inside the vaults of government, but it's not something they readily share with the outside world. You're not going to have conferences where they're going to have government officials, military officials, academic officials sort of roaming around at a conference, having presentations, trading ideas, which is how knowledge gets spread around this sort of thing. And the academic research world is one that's very, very heavily wedded, not necessarily to government, but to money. You can have the smartest people in the world, name your university, working on problems, but they're not going to work on problems unless they have funding. Yeah. Even if you're a philosophy professor teaching philosophy, which doesn't have big government contracts, you still have to have money coming in to pay the salaries of the people who are doing it, pay the administration, pay the light bill, etc. If you don't have the money, you don't have that education going on in those institutions. You don't have the interchange of ideas to move that knowledge forward. And UAP, the world of UAP, is one of those where, sure, there's research going on, In fact, I work independently with several research groups, including some within the aviation research community, but they're not heavily funded. In fact, a lot of them are not funded at all. You might have independent folks who have their day jobs doing whatever, and they're studying this because they see it as an area of concern. That happens in my world in aviation safety all the time. Yes, there's the FAA. They do flight testing over at the FAA Tech Center in Atlantic City. There's a whole lot of testing going on all the time. Takes a lot of money. But there might be 1,000 risks out there. How does a risk bubble up from being kind of known but no money being thrown at it to one where there's significant money being thrown at it? It takes time. And it might take a radical event to happen before people pay attention to it. Now, one of the areas I used to work in and still have contacts here is the bird strike community, in that birds have been hitting airplanes since airplanes started flying. That's nothing new. But birds as a safety issue that can take out a jet airliner, that was kind of known, but how much work was being done on it? Well, folks inside the community, myself included, understood the risk. We understood how birds operate to the extent that, hey, there are certain characteristics of how they fly, which could impact the airplane, literally and figuratively, and take it out of the sky. Should we push to have regulatory change so that there's either training or technology or bird suppression programs in place to make this happen? And that was like a generational thing. That is, we knew the risk, the government knew the risk, the people flying knew the risk, but what does it take to move the needle? Well, it's a slow process and usually takes a lot of give and take between the folks with the money, the airlines, the government, the airport operators, and the folks who are facing the risk, those people who are flying in the airplanes. And sometimes you have a dramatic event that happens that pushes that along. For example, the Miracle on the Hudson, when Sully landed and his crew landed in the Hudson River, that was actually a bird strike event.
Yeah.
And in fact, this was 2009. And years before, right after I started my website in 1996. In about 1999, I was working with the bird strike community. I said, hey, folks, we should put together a website, which again, at the time, it was uncommon for small organizations, especially unfunded ones, to have their own internet presence, because this was shortly after the World Wide Web became a thing. I don't know if you remember this, but in the days of America Online, the internet was what they called a walled garden. That is, the stuff that AOL had within their own space, you could circulate around that. But going outside to other websites, that was like almost impossible. This is just a few years after that. I said, hey, it doesn't have to be fancy. We can answer the 10 basic questions. We can put links to research. We can talk about what are the risks, et cetera, et cetera. Because here's what I think will happen. One of these days, we'll have the mother of all bird strikes, and everybody from all over the world will try to figure out on the internet, what's this bird strike thing about? I want them to come to us, not to some clown out there who's talking nonsense about birds. We want to have a concentrated piece of information so that when that day happens, we'll get the call. Fast forward, 2009, I happened to be giving a presentation at a tech company about using the internet for marketing. And in the middle of it, my phone starts blowing up. Now, I was running my business at that time, and because of the time zone I live in, the kind of work I was doing, it was like a global sort of thing. So it's like, hey, I'm communicating primarily by email because I don't have to be awake 24/7. So I rarely got phone calls. So my phone starts blowing up, and I joke to the people, it's like, hey, I only get phone calls like this when the plane crashes, but I didn't hear anything on the news, so let's just keep talking. Hours later, I'm driving home. Yes, I shouldn't have been doing this. I looked at my phone, it's like dozens of messages and whatnot. It's like, I looked at CNN, it's like, oh my God, it was a bird strike. And the website worked exactly like we wanted. We got a whole lot of traffic, a whole lot of attention. Some of the people in our field got to go on TV and talk about it. So that was the goal. To move the needle, we have useful information. It sits there until someone stumbles across it, or we tell them, hey, go over here and check this out. And slowly we increase the level of understanding of that risk. Fast forward to UAP, a different kind of problem exists. The zone has been flooded with garbage.
Yes.
Go online, you see all kinds of stuff. So how do you break through all that garbage? I look at this as a long-term marketing effort. We have 50, 60 years of popular culture to deal with. The U.S. government, to their credit, actually helped by saying, you know what, we're going to officially recognize this under a new name. And in fact, two things your audience probably knows, 2017, when the New York Times had their big article about what was going on.
Yes.
That was a huge game changer. One of the three authors, Leslie Keene, I'd actually interviewed 4 years before on my podcast.
Oh, did you?
I did. 2010, she had a book where she basically put together reports from government agencies, militaries from around the world, even had some of those who were involved in either witnessing the event or studying the event contribute to her book. So this was hardcore information from folks who had decades of experience in their fields, who had reputations to uphold. And she was a serious journalist who was not a UFO journalist. She was like a traditional journalist doing all sorts of stories. And she put this into a book. I thought, this is something I can sink my teeth into. After I read the book, I reached out to her and eventually got her to have an interview. And it's still out there on the internet from 2013. Lovely interview. And some of the same themes I talk about today, I talked about then. So when I saw her name in 2017, I started paying really close attention. Fast forward, 4 years later, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is the government agency which oversees all the intelligence agencies. Technically, this office is over the CIA, the NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, 17 different intelligence agencies. They had a report that basically said UAP were both a potential safety of flight issue and a potential national security issue. They said it in plain English. That was the first time I'd seen a serious high-level government organization say specifically that UFO/UAP were an aviation safety concern. So I said to myself, I've got to start pushing a little bit harder to get my aviation community on board with at least talking about this. And something as basic as, what's the definition of UAP? The U.S. government, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, they had their own set of definitions that were very much dealing with military and national security concerns. Okay. NASA, they actually had a study team in 2023, published a report, I believe, in 2024, which talked about UAP from the NASA's perspective. They looked at it from the scientific perspective. They had a broader view, including things like weather and such, which that was a good perspective. I said, in aviation safety, we have to have our own definitions. If there's not a formal definition from the FAA or from ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, then we have to come up with a working definition so we can go forward. Something as basic as, how do you categorize something? What is a UAP? And I've come up with my own set of definitions for my colleagues to work with. And the goal there is, let's start the conversation with something in black and white, something we can all look at and argue over, and then get some buy-in from other folks within the community. So at least we have a common working knowledge of what we're talking about. And the other thing, and this is what I've been researching last year or so, I thought to myself, I've been diving through aviation safety databases of all kinds for years. US, Canadian, accident reports from overseas. I've used Google Translate a lot to translate accident reports from every language you can think of. I don't speak Farsi, but Iran, when they have an accident, they have their official reports in Farsi. It's like, I can't understand any of this. I run it through Google Translate. I can understand 20% of it. Okay. Right. I'll take 20% of something over 100% of nothing any day of the week. But that said, I said, let me go into the databases I know best. Are there UAP reports that don't have UAP written in them? I went to one database, one of my favorites, NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System. You can anonymously send in a report about anything dealing with safety. And they don't publish all of them, but they publish some. Long story short, I went through their online database of reports going back decades to 1988, I think. They've been around since like 76, but the online database only went back to 88. I found 13 cases which fit my definition, broad, of UAP. Sometimes it was like truly bizarre.
Yeah.
Other times it was, gosh, this looks conventional, but it's definitely out of place.
Yeah.
I'm an airline pilot flying up the East Coast. I see something that looks like a missile flying horizontally over on the side here. I see it go down and I see it go up again. I thought, okay, missiles with a contrail, that makes sense. Missiles flying horizontally, that's kind of unusual. Yeah. Missiles going down and up near the East Coast in the vicinity of New York, within like 40, 50 miles of New York, that should have had alarm bells left, right, and sideways. I don't know what this was. Even if it was a conventional rocket, it shouldn't be there. And another one, I think it was the same one, said, yes, I could see that it had a rounded front. Now, I'm a pilot, not a very good one. I've only had a few hundred hours, but I know one thing. It's hard to see aircraft in the air, even large aircraft. And so if it's too far away, you really can't tell the shape except there's an airplane flying.
Right.
How close do you have to be, or how big does a missile have to be before you can say definitively it had a rounded front?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah,
So
he had to either be very close. Yeah. Or it had to be huge.
And that's one. And I love that database because anybody can send something in. But NASA has their own internal team which analyzes this before they put it into the database. Now, NASA does this database on behalf of the FAA, the thought being, well, gee, if I report to NASA and the rules are in place such that if I happen to break a rule and I'm self-reporting that I broke a rule and I put it in this database, and the only way the FAA finds out about it is through this database, I won't get sanctioned. So this database has two purposes. One, to put in safety events of all sorts. Two, for people to self-report when they violate a regulation.
Yeah.
Let's say, for hypothetically, I see something and I juke and jive in my airplane. I have to dive 1,000 feet down. Air traffic control had told me to stay at A-level altitude, but I actually dived down. I'd write up the report. There's a safety aspect to it. I had to avoid a mid-air collision. And there was a regulatory aspect. I had to dive down 1,000 feet. So if the FAA runs the radar tapes and sees me diving down 1,000 feet, they track me down. I already have a report on file saying, hey, I did this for this reason. They're going to leave me alone. That's one database. Second database is the FAA UAS sightings report. UAS is the FAA term for drone, unmanned aircraft system. I might get that wrong. Please don't nail me to the wall for that.
No, it's fine.
By the way, it is unmanned. And I said to an FAA official once, it's like, why don't you do something more generic like uncrewed? Same concept, except it's not, gender specific. She basically said, look, we have to use the terms that are authorized, and until there's legislation or regulatory change, we have to use unmanned.
Yeah.
So that's one of the positives and the negatives of the FAA. Yes, they have rules. Yes, they have definitions. But if you need to change something or add something, it'll take some time. But I digress. This UAS sightings report has 13,000 reports that were online. You can download them in a spreadsheet right now if you want. And these are reports where it was not directly from the pilot, but the pilot reports something. The air traffic controller gets the report. They pass it through management, and it gets put into the database. So you have 2 or 3 filters here that keeps nonsense from getting in there, because you have senior people, presumably managers, who look at any report before they put it in there. I have found dozens of events that don't make sense. Some of them with enough detail that makes you really scratch your head. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm flying in a plane 13,000 feet over Lubbock, and I see a 2-foot beach ball size something fly right over my left wing. It had green lights around it. I thought, all right, 13,000 feet at night is kind of high for any kind of drone. I get that. What about a balloon? So I whipped out my pencil and paper, got the equations for how much buoyancy would you have to be at 13,000 feet and have, some kind of payload. And I thought, let's say you had a balloon filled with hydrogen, which is dangerous, but it's like lighter than helium. So it's more buoyant than helium. How much payload could you have in something the size of a beach ball at 13,000 feet? So the balloon envelope, any equipment you have on board, any power system, any battery would have to be less than 4 ounces. That's like 4 AA batteries. And I thought, you could possibly build something that is a balloon that's the weight of 4 AA batteries that has lights on it and whatnot, but would it also be able to maneuver itself close enough to an airplane to pass by it by a few feet and miss it? Or is it just a random balloon? Well, if it's a random balloon, I don't know of many balloons that are launched that are that small, that have lights on them, that have that capacity. And if this were a random thing, either some lucky kid or some lucky inventor happened to fly a balloon that just happened to miss a plane by 2 feet, or there are gazillions of these out there, and this just happens to be randomly one that almost hit an airplane, or it's something else. So I'm not saying it was unconventional.
Yeah, but
I'm saying it's unusual. It's bizarre.
Todd, yeah, that's completely bizarre. Wow, Todd, I'm gonna have to bring you back, man. to go through some of these stories. I'm fascinated by this, and I love your scientific take on it, because you're right. A lot of this stuff is just garbage. It's like so many people flooded the zone with information. Part of it is because of the way the government has not been the most clear, and I think a lot of people would say honest about this stuff. But I appreciate your take on this, man. Thank you for this, Todd. I got to bring you back, man, within a week or so.
Well, I hope that events don't transpire where I need to come back in a day or so.
That too. I mean, considering, that too. I don't want anybody to get hit. I don't want any plane to go down for anything like this. And like I said, the government has not been a straight shooter with this. Trump has said he's going to be honest and basically reveal whatever the government knows about it. So we'll see if he keeps with that. Thank you for this, man. Todd Curtis.
Thank you.
Todd Curtis has spent most of his career in aviation, focusing on aviation safety. After earning an electrical engineering degree in Princeton University and the University of Texas, he served for the U.S. Air Force as a flight test engineer. After earning a master's degree in policy and management from MIT, he was safety engineer at Boeing, where he supported accident investigation as well as conducted safety analysis during the development of the 777. While at Boeing, he also created the aviation safety website, airsafe.com, and wrote the book, Understanding Aviation Safety Data, which described both the approach to analyzing aviation risk and evaluating accidents and incident trends. Since leaving Boeing, he has become a risk consultant, focusing on systematically using data to understand and reduce aviation incidents. He is also one of the contributors to the Flight Safety Detectives podcast, which evaluates accidents, incidents, and risk from all areas of aviation. Todd Curtis, my man, thank you for this, man. Be safe. Have a good one, man.
You too.